What a bizarre moment we're in. Like I said, I have had this energy, this flame that has been driving in me with all of the protests that have been taking place over the past few weeks. And that little budding thing of hope, just hope it continues to keep going. This is a weird inflection point. The world has basically fallen off of its axis, and attention, almost as if it turned on a dime, looked at America and say, what's this black thing? With the American public, overwhelmingly majority white, says, yes, you guys have a point. That was utterly atrocious. And we accept these protests, these multiracial, multi-identity protests of people flinging their bodies into the streets. That is phenomenal. You don't understand. Like, for me, this is utterly and entirely profound to see this much support across the United States from a killing. Cops kill 1,000 people a year in the United States. And they do so, yes, brazenly, because there's no accountability in that process. From 2013 to 2019, of all the cops' killings, 99% got off. In fact, 99% weren't even charged. Put that in perspective. That means there's no accountability for maximum justice. Whether or not the maximum justice was dispensed in legitimate, rational terms. You incentivize that process. That takes place all around the United States. The wild part about this is what Chauvin did when he murdered George Floyd by standing on his throat was something that he did probably day in and day out, and nobody thought twice about it. This is the way policing is done. There's a problem with that, especially when that's something that is basically routine, that ends up with these murders. The world was aghast by it, utterly appalled. We have 1,000 killings a year by cops. That is a shameful and appalling number. That is a national stain that's accepted. And yet it's accepted year after year after year. Our closest neighbor, special relationship, 3. There's something wrong, fundamentally, when that is taking place and that is accepted. These protests have taken all over. This is Los Angeles. Look at this. Massive numbers of people. Do you honestly think that all of these people, different races, identify themselves as different genders, are out here doing this entirely, specifically, in solidarity with the black issue? Or do you think there's something broader that they're feeling and that is digging into them? This is DC. They have been out there day after day after day after day. And God knows, the question becomes, how long can they last? This is Sydney, just to make the point that this is not just in the United States. I could show you the UK, I could show you New Zealand, France, etc., etc. There's something that is in our world that is not going right, where they have supplanted their ills and issues with their society in the same way that all of these different groups have, and put it into the fastest thing moving, which is this. Now the catch becomes, what is the demand of this movement? There's so many people out there, but what is the demand of this movement? Now, if I may be so humble, I would like to make the argument on what the demand of this movement needs to be. Not just should be, needs to be. It's required to be. What you're going to have is a political apparatus that has fundamentally been discredited in its ability to dispense what the public needs to not have the public out into the streets like that. The initial protests were done not necessarily because of the killing. People would understand killings took place by cops if it was rare and if it was prosecuted when there was a dispensing of force that was unnecessary. The issue here is that it happens over and over and over again with little to no accountability to it. Not to mention there seems to be a disparity in regards to where it goes. My only basic point is you have a lot of people out there for the last 8 years who've been told, are you willing to fight for somebody in the way that you're willing to fight for yourself? And those people said yes. But those people also, on some level, understood that they were fighting for themselves because the issues and the broader concerns that are taking place in regards to this notion of policing affects all of them in the same way it affects all of us, because those things are intrinsic to issues of class. I want to talk about the demands that needs to take place. You're going to have a political system that, has been discredited. Those people wouldn't be out in the streets otherwise. And beyond being discredited, incapable of giving you in honest to God, real terms, what you actually want, whether you can articulate it or not. And that's the danger. Because your political system will try to give you something, a token gesture, a performative measure that gives you a phantom of something that you may actually think is real in sense of the way you've been talking about this issue, but in real terms misses the mark entirely. The black politic, in regards to democratic politics, Democrats have broken fundamentally black politics. If you look back to the 60s, black politics was intrinsically linked to issues of class. Your being here is a testament to that. You would not be here otherwise if it was not for this notion of profitability off of your black skin and black body. The point I'm trying to make here is, as Democrats have moved further and further to the left, this notion of inequality, this notion of class and economics basically was off the table. And they talked about identity as if it was something specific, only to identity, as if Obama's blackness was somehow going to stop him from giving 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Or for that matter, boasting about the number of jobs he created when 95% were part-time or contract. I'll tell you this, his blackness did not stop him from giving people of that class a ton of cash. This is kind of what I'm getting at here. The token gestures that take place, the performative trash, the measures, this sugar without necessarily the real vitamins and nutrients. As a demand, if you're going to have this many people out on the streets, this many people agitated, if you're at this level of an inflection point where the public itself agrees with you and asks, okay, what do you want? Your political space is going to give you something that doesn't really give you anything. What you need to ask for, your demand, needs to be on this notion of not just police and the policing and why policing and how policing do their job, but also why those cops are there in the first place. And if you're going to make an argument about it, make the argument to get rid of cops, the necessity of them. It's one thing to defund the police. It's another thing to organically make them redundant and unnecessary because you've removed the need and even the logic for them being there. Your demand needs to be larger than just defunding the police. Your demand needs to be to get rid of poverty in general. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. Of course, you can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. Like I said, modestly offer this demand. And I offer this demand because I haven't necessarily heard a demand. And if a demand needs to be made, it should be made, it should be broad, it should be expansive, and it should deal with what you, at the very least, can articulate in real terms of what you can get done. We are only asking for the infinitely possible. And even though they may consider it radical and your political system may go through heaves when you make your case, but that doesn't matter. They don't want to give you that anyway. They hate the fact that you're out in the streets. They want that energy dumped into a way that it can be controlled, corralled, and basically dispersed. Don't allow them to do that. Pretend for the moment that I'm right, that this is not just a black issue, that this issue goes beyond this notion of race and this notion of policing. I hate to show this video again, but this is Eric Garner being choked to death. Take a watch. Human being dragged down to the ground and choked to death. Infinite justice! Why? He had the temerity to annoy that cop. Was there other things that cop could do? Yes. Was that chokehold illegal? Yes. Was the fact that it illegal stop that cop from walk? No. There are things that you can do in the context of specifically dealing with the way police behave and everything else and accountability. That's true. Would that have stopped this encounter. I'm talking about stopping the encounter in the first place. Here's the other one. I hate to show this, but you've seen this video before. Chauvin casually kneeling on a human being's neck for 9 minutes as that person begged and gasped for breath, with Chauvin not having the humanity to basically ensure that he didn't murder the person to which he was supposed to be taking into custody. Now, what if the argument that we need to, as the Democrats are going to do, we need to make police more accountable and everything else, what if those interactions are in the bricks? Meaning, giving them kittens is not going to make it work. Even making these notions of accountability is not going to work. The weird part is that cops aren't supposed to dispense maximum justice on a whim anyway. So saying, hey, you guys shouldn't do this, that was already there. I'm getting to the point that is it possible that it is in the bricks that these interactions take place. And those interactions can't necessarily be quelled just by dealing with the issue of cops, this one side of the equation. Right here. This is Nixon. Why? Why did Nixon start the drug war? The entire point of the drug war was to target blacks and hippies for political gain. It's in the bricks. This is the point I'm trying to get across to you. What if dealing with the cop part of that is in and of itself radically insufficient to get you what you want in regards to stopping those interactions from taking place? John Ehrlichman, who served 18 months in prison for a central role in the Watergate scandal, was Nixon's chief domestic advisor when the president announced the war on drugs in 1971. The administration cited a high death toll and negative social impacts of drugs to justify the expanding the Federal Drug Control Agency. Doing so set the scene for decades of socially and economically disastrous policies. You know what this was really about, he asked, with the bluntness of a man who, after public disgrace, was stretched in federal prison, had little left to protect. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against either the war or blacks, but we could publicly associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalize both heavily. We could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course. You fixing cops doesn't fix that. Doesn't touch that. And to make that more, you must understand what I mean by this. For the Democratic Party to give you some token gesture of saying, let's deal with the cops, doesn't deal with the interactions that are incentivized just entirely in the way that your society is organized. It is in the bricks, not just necessarily in the people who are gravitate towards the police force or the training or even the just natural incentives and being given that much authority in the first place. Not to mention no accountability. But it is somewhat in the bricks for these interactions to take place for various members of your community and various members of law enforcement. How do you stop that? That's your question. Your question is not how to make cops cuddlier. Your question is how to stop the fact that the cops are interacting with you in the first place. Why would you want an item of law and order, this explicit thing of force in your community, regardless of what the community is? They're not out there in Beverly Hills patrolling around in cars. Would you want them to be? You want them, or some people want them in their communities because they're concerned about their communities and the safety in those communities. And I'm making the point that the way you deal with that is by fixing the communities, not making the cops cuddlier. Your argument is to get rid of poverty. That is the demand. The collective demand of each and every person who's coming out here says, yes, there's an African-American issue for this, but the African-American issue is basically intrinsic to the issue of race, which is intrinsic to the way we deal with cops. If you want to stop cops from killing people, African-Americans, whites, otherwise, get rid of the conditions that allow cops to engage with your society in these ways. That's your demand. That demand is very specific. It is a choice that we make to allow poverty in our society. Jeff Bezos is going to be a trillionaire. It is a choice. It is a conscious choice. Your political system, Democrat and Republican, has taken economics off the table because of the people who they cater to. 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash. Who do you lean to? You lean to the side with the most cash. Where are those policies going to go? In the same direction. And the moment that you remove any level of accountability in the political process, blue no matter who, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to get people who take off the real material concerns of the public off the table. And so we can have these conversations about policing, but you can't have the conversations about the reasons that the policing is necessary in those communities at all. Because you don't want to deal in real ways. How do we get, as a society, what is the real way to get rid of poverty? If you want to see just a basic connection between poverty and crime, it's somewhat of a rational thing, right? It's not determinative, it's somewhat statistical, but the statisticals, metrics are real human beings, real issues of trauma that are being discussed in those statistics. And again, if you're just talking about broad strokes, I'll take a broad stroke of 40% off the top in regards to poverty and see the number of crime, and then we can get together later and figure out how to get rid of the rest. I'm making the point that if you really want to deal with it, deal with it. If you're going to have this many people in the street, if you're going to have this many people agitating all around the world is watching. How much energy went into that? And what is commensurate with the amount of energy you're putting into it? And is the human rights demand, get rid of poverty. It is unnatural and obscene. It is not a natural condition. It is a condition that we choose through acts of policy. Get rid of it. And you can get rid of crime. And you can increase the effectiveness, not to mention the vitality of your particular society. Crime and poverty, just to make the point that much more plain. People living in households in the United States that have an income level below the federal poverty threshold have more than double the rate of violent victimization compared to individuals in high-income households. For both whites and blacks, African Americans in the United States, the overall pattern of being in poverty with the highest rates of victimization was consistent. Take out everything, all of the factors, these guys are basically the same. Urban poverty increased the risk of violence and crime in the United States households, but did not change other factors. Let's go to another one. Right here. According to Becker's economic theory of crime, the relative benefits of committing a crime, and this is logical, just to make the point. In fact, let's show this one first. They were going through and looking at crime data based on neighborhoods, making a comparison between the wealth of a neighborhood versus the crime associated with the neighborhood. Again, the results are rational. People arrested that year live all over the city, but areas with lower incomes show higher percentages of arrests. The analyst use census tracts to measure concentrations of people living under or below 125% below the federal poverty line. The areas with the highest low income level had the highest rate of felony arrests. Basically, the areas that are the poorest had the highest instance of crime. That's logical, right? If you're in a situation where you have a house, you have a dog, you have a car, you have a wife, you might have things that you do in your particular life. What is your upside for crime in that situation? Meaning, what do you get out of it by, boosting cars or selling X or selling Y? Compared to the downside. Meaning, you're not going to get much out of that since you already have this other stuff. Your level of satisfaction for doing anything else at that point is minimum in comparison to how much it would suck if you run afoul of the law. Now, make that same comparison to somebody who may not necessarily be living in a great situation where the upside is cash, eating that week, doing X or doing Y, but your upside changes. The basic term is comparison. In the sense of a person who has what they need, well, they may not take that risk. A person who doesn't have what they need, that risk seems that much more apt. It may even seem necessary given a certain situation. I'm making the point that there is a direct comparison, not determinative, statistical, in regards to how you can look at your society and say, hey, if we get rid of that, we can eliminate the need for those cops, because you eliminate the need for poverty in communities that are basically healthy and thriving. This is not to say that you get rid of everything in one swoop, but I am saying that from the standpoint of something that you can materially do and that you can materially demand from the standpoint of the group, and that is infinitely possible to do, that's a start. And that's a start that would cut down on the need of those cops, let alone make policy in regards to dealing with the other side of that equation. To, again, make this that much more plain, and it makes logical sense. According to Becker's economic theory of crime, the relative benefits of committing a crime are greater in communities with greater income inequality compared to those of more even income distribution. Thus, as the benefits to crime increases, holding all things equal, the level of crime increases. Well, no shit, right? If I'm in a community that is in disrepute and that's been abandoned, and I have the ability to create crime in there, and I have an incentive to do so because I get something out of this, then you're going to do it. It's basically saying if you have the potential to do crime and get benefits off of crime, will crime increase? Yes. Yes. But the main point there, though, is if you have a decent space, then your reason for doing crime evaporates. That's the point that I'm trying to get at. We're making this argument continually about how do we deal with the cops. And while you're going to have some cops that are racist, you're going to have some cops that have screws loose and whatnot. I would prefer to just not deal with them at all and to eliminate the need for them to be in those communities, be having these interactions in the first place. The demand is not necessarily specifically, we need to do something about the cops. Yes, you got to do something with the cops. But the demand really is, how do we eliminate the need for them to be in these communities, interacting with people, regardless, at all? And this goes to other factors that don't necessarily get mentioned as hard factors, like the stress of being poor, the incentive structures that are built into that stuff. I am making the very basic point that there are things that we can do in our society to eliminate the need for cops, where you can defund cops organically by basically building up the areas that are abandoned in your society. There's one last point I want to make for this, meaning the racial connection. Right here. 44% of the United States earns $18,000 a year. We're talking about poverty, and we're talking about the connection between poverty and crime. 44% of your society earns $18,000 a year. Blacks only make up 13% of the society. So if we're disproportionate in this, just still understand the majority of these people are white. Now, the point I'm trying to get at here is, what is the lifestyle and living conditions? And what is the need of a society when you have this much inequality? And is it not necessary, almost by definition, to have something that keeps the order in a society that will fling itself apart because of the amount of inequality that's in that system, meaning those cops? For the cops to say we're there to protect and serve, that's great, but you're there to protect and maintain order of basically a disordered system or inequitable system. You have no power to do anything to appease that other than to put people in prison and to ruin lives. Our issue, our plight in the society should be to not do that and to figure out a way to stop that. And part and parcel to doing that is to not have people trying to live off of $18,000 a year. Right here. In 2016, the median black household had $18,000 in net worth compared to $171,000 for whites. That's not magic. And when you have this thing of, well, wait a minute, the gap hasn't gone anywhere. No, the gap hasn't gone anywhere. Year after year after year after year after year, wealth expands on itself. So the money that we did not have, coming vestiges of slavery or whatever, compared to the money that the other group had, it grew, outstood. You have to deal with that. That's an honest appraisal of your society and the vestiges of that society. Those are things that need to be fundamentally addressed if you're going to honestly deal with it. And the catch becomes, does your political system have the means to dealing with that? Honestly, no, they don't. And that's why those people are in the streets. To give you this notion, don't let Democrats co-opt this. If you want to hear the Democratic message, first, Nancy Pelosi saying basically, don't offer support for Black Lives Matter. That's the honest position. That's the honest. The kente cloth is politics. The honesty is don't offer support for Black Lives Matter policy. They are trying to co-opt and to basically dispel. That's all they're doing. Don't let them do it. The honest position of the man who has the nerve to be at Floyd's funeral. Listen to what Biden talks about in regards to real policy.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing.
I hope all those people at the Floyd funeral knows that Joe Biden is talking about you right now. He's talking about throwing away people of the society. Now, more important, what he said in the beginning is unhinged. And the reality of it is, those things that he mentioned are the things that actually do matter. And it's the reason right now, or at that moment, you were having that specific conversation about various elements of your society that you were finding to be problematic. You decided to not invest in those societies. And you were shocked as shit when, based on the factors of your society, it produced that outcome. Now, I agree that there may be something in specific because your decision space has been constrained. But you are still in a position to deal with the larger concerns that are being created by the things that you literally just articulated and you said didn't matter. My point to you is those are the things that matter most. Those are the things that matter most because those are the things that is literally creating the conditions in the society itself. This speech is so unhinged, Joe Biden goes on to argue that Reagan should have been putting more people to death than the death penalty. This is the person who is now trying to take up the mantle and speak at George Floyd's. He fucking constructed the system. That's what's so aggravating about this, that basically these are the people who are going to try to co-opt that movement. Listen to him. Here's a little bit more from Joe Biden in his crime speech. Let's hear Joe Biden's real thoughts.
To engage in such statements, but let's look at the facts. Since 1986, Congress has passed over 230 new or expanded penalties for drug and criminal offenses in this United States. 230 new penalties. And these penalties range from an automatic 5 years in jail for any person caught with a rock of crack cocaine, a piece of crack cocaine as small as a quarter. I don't have a quarter with me, but if you visualize what one looks like, yeah, I do have a quarter. If you have a piece of crack cocaine no bigger than this quarter that I'm holding in my hand, 1/4 of $1, we passed a law through the leadership of Senator Thurmond and myself and others, a law that says if you're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years. Yes. You get no probation. You get nothing other than 5 years in jail.
He is basically, I don't know if you know who Senator Strom Thurmond is. Strom Thurmond is a Singing in the Daylight Races, part of the Dixiecrat bunch. And Joe Biden was close friends to that Singing in the Daylight Races. And yeah, pushing through policies to put more black bodies in prison. Joe Biden was perfectly aware, which is the reason why he was using that without father stuff when he was making his argument, that crack cocaine and cocaine had crack and cocaine had a disparity. And that people were being put in prison for much longer sentences for one over the other, despite the fact that you had one racial dynamic that used one as opposed to a racial dynamic that used the other. The white persuasion, or the people who were of wealth and of means, who tended to use cocaine, well, their sentencing was less. The people who used crack, they got more. They knew that the disparity was there. They knew that chemically these things were pretty much the same. Didn't matter. Throw them in prison, lock away the key, and bragging about keeping people in prison without the judge having any say-so in the process. Look, I am making the point that your criminal justice system was basically constructed and created by people like this. And this notion of go vote, there is no one to vote for on this issue. It was constructed by people like this. I can show you video after video. I have the video up right now where Joe Biden is bragging that Ronald Reagan hadn't thrown enough people or put enough people to death, or didn't put enough people in prison for life. Now, whether they're good or bad people or not, I think that's secondary to the point that Joe Biden's point of view in this is, I don't give a shit how people came out. I am just going to use the state to bash and batter and basically ruin those people because I'm going to be tough and you're not going to call me weak on crime. So I take issue with the person who's been lying about civil rights now in these black churches and talking to the Floyd family when he was infinitely, uniquely culpable for that death, without any say-so or without any ability at all to do anything about it now to remedy it based on policy that he's going to put forth. Don't let them co-opt this movement. Don't let them turn this entirely into a policing issue. This is not entirely a policing issue. I tell you this, whatever you want to think of cops, at the end of the day, these guys are doing a job that is a fucking horrible job. And the mental anguish, you can see it just in the number of suicides. My point of view on this eliminates them. It eliminates that anguish. This is kind of my point. I'm not being punitive to one side or the other. I'm just making the point that I don't want these two things to meet in the first place. And you prevent those two things from meeting in the first place, at least in broad terms, by getting rid of poverty. You could do that. Medicare for all, elimination of student debt, ensuring higher wages, increasing taxes on the rich. Maybe Jeff Bezos don't become a trillionaire. Maybe Jeff Bezos only has $10 billion. But whatever you need to do, get rid of poverty. Hey, if you want to stop cops from basically pulling people over in the street, deal with racial bias on that, create a system that cars are automatic. That way you try to get rid of tickets. Instead of trying to criminalize things, what about doing things to try to just prevent the criminalization of it? Hey, there are jobs right there. You've just created another job for your government to give to somebody. I'm making the point that your country make policy choices. And those policy choices have been having atrocious outcomes because those policy choices have been in the sense of how do we make people's lives miserable? How do we use the blunt force of the law? But in this very specific terms, instead of looking at this and saying, what are the outcomes when we allow a certain degree of poverty to languish? And instead of dealing with the poverty, the response has just been throw in cops. You don't need the cops if you don't have poverty. That's my point. If you're going to make your argument, all of these people marching, big demands, enthusiastic, euphoric, emancipatory, then make your demand as big. Otherwise, it squanders this inflection point. Your demand, regardless of what your political system bitches and moans about what your demand is, your demand, elimination of poverty. Some people may bitch and say, well, wait a minute, that's going to be more white people. I find that to be irrelevant. Eliminate poverty, eliminate crime, eliminate the need for those cops to be having those interactions in the first place. In 10 years, we can have another spasm like this and we can discuss what's left over. But if you're looking for broad strokes in regards to a infinitely doable goal, an objective, a moonshot, something that our generation has a moral demand in order to conquer and achieve, get rid of poverty. Your society would be infinitely healthier, infinitely happier, infinitely better. And your issues of crime and policing will go down organically. Like, share, subscribe.